So we're doing some tricky business here with our routes. You've used switch before, but inside switch, you just had a bunch of route components probably, right? Well, this route component looks a little different than the route components you've used before because it's got a redirect in there. So what did your routes look like before? What did most of them look like? What props did they have? Route, path, is that what you said? Okay, path. What else? Component. So component isn't on this one. We have render instead. So instead of pointing it at a component that the path should route to, you can instead just put a render function right in here and put some JSX in there. What's the difference? Why? Now in this case, it's a redirect component, which is something that is built into React Router, but that you didn't actually use. You can guess what it does. So what's actually happening here is if it doesn't match either of these routes, then we just redirect it back to the list of nodes. So why did I do this instead of just saying component equal redirect? Any idea? If you're using route component equal some component, how do you pass props to that component? You can't, right? That's true, isn't it, Seth? That's why you would do this. You can't pass props if you're using component equal something. All you can tell is which component to render. But if that component needs to receive anything from the outside, you can't do it that way. So you can put the JSX for that component and then pass in whatever props you like. So it looks a little funny putting an arrow function in here that returns some JSX, but I'm pretty sure we've actually done that before in a slightly different context. So that's how this works. I'm telling it that if it hits this route, we redirect, but redirect needs this prop to know where we're redirecting to. Now, this business is a little more complicated. So private route and public route are not built into React Router. We wrote them in another file. So see if you can tell what they're doing. Okay, private route looks like it takes some props. Path, just like a normal route would take, right? Auth, you may remember, is just like whether we're signed in or not. So it takes that prop, so it's making some decision based on that. And then render, just like we did down here. So it looks like a lot of the props are the same props you would pass to a normal route. So render instead of component, because we want to put some JSX in here. So it's going to render this main component, which you may remember is basically everything that's actually on the screen here. The navigation, the list of notes, the form for the current note. Those are all inside main. So it's like things list was in the other one. Or if you did the homework where you could extract that into another component, it's like that. We pass the notes in. And then we have another one of these funny things, this time public route instead of private route. It again takes a path. It again takes whether we're logged in or not. And it renders the sign-in component. And the sign-in component needs that auth handler method because, of course, that's the thing that actually does the signing in. So who remembers what I said these do? Or who can guess from the names public route and private route? It's probably not quite big enough. What do you think it does? Yeah.
Make sure if you're logged in, it sends you one way, and if you're not logged in, it sends you a different way.
Okay. So if your path matches this route, it's gonna invoke this private route. But We shouldn't necessarily render main, because if we're not logged in, you're not allowed to go to main. So what we've done is basically enhanced the normal route component with this additional logic that checks to see if you're logged in first. So let's look at the code for that. I made a file called route helpers that contains both of these components. So private route. Notice its arguments, its props. There's a component that gets passed in. There's the render prop, there's the auth prop, and then this rest, that means all the other props that were passed in. Because a lot of times when you use these curly braces in the argument list, we only want certain ones, right? But here we need everything else they passed in too, even if we have nothing specific we want to do with it. The reason is we're trying to make this a substitute for a regular old route component. We want the user to be able to use private route just like they would use route. We've added in some logic to check authentication, but we want them to be able to use it the same, which means any props they pass into our component, we want to pass on to the route component that we're going to render. So we need to receive every prop that they receive. So that's what we do. So if you look at how this works, it returns a route component. It passes in all the props that they pass to us. And then it again has a render function that's going to render one of a couple different components. So we've added some logic to this arrow function. Now we did it as a ternary, which makes it not the easiest thing in the world to read. So I'll break it down. Auth question mark. In other words, if you're authed, if you are signed in, then render. This is some. We're doing quite a few different tricks here, which is part of why we didn't bother to like build this from scratch in class. So if this blows your mind a little bit, don't worry too much about it. This is definitely advanced. I haven't even explained what this whole concept is called yet. So if we are authenticated, then we've got this OR statement here. This whole thing, if we look at this entire line, it's a big OR, right? Here's OR in the middle. On the left, we have render and render with parentheses. So seems like I want to call the render function. But if I just call the render function with parentheses and there is no render function, I'm going to get, undefined is not a function. That's the error I would get. So first I check to see if render exists. And if render exists, then I actually call it. So even though there's an and there, that doesn't necessarily mean this whole thing is going to return a Boolean. It's going to actually evaluate both sides of that and, right? So it's going to evaluate the first part of the and, which is just the word render. So if render is undefined, if it's something falsy, it's never even going to check the right side of the and. I don't know if you know this, but most programming languages work this way. It checks the left side first, and if it's an and, then both parts have to be true. So if that part isn't true, it's not going to bother checking the other part. So we can use this trick sometimes to call functions that may or may not actually exist at a given point in time. So we check that render exists, and if it exists, we call it. If that whole thing evaluates to false because render doesn't exist, then we call component and pass the props along. So component is a variable. It's an argument that got passed in. Because when we used private route, we passed in main. So it's going to be main. Why didn't I just hardcode main in here? Because the point is, I could put anything in here. I can use private route in a lot of different places to achieve the same effect of only if they're logged in should you bother rendering this component. But it could be any component. In this case, it's main, but we pass it in as a variable so that private route can render any component that we happen to pass in. So this is called composition. Composition in this context is like a component generator. We generate components based on some logic that we put in here. So that's what we're doing. So if we weren't signed in the first place, then we're going to hit the else, the thing that comes after the colon. And that's a redirect. Redirect to sign in. And then in the state, we keep track of where they were redirected from. Now, I haven't actually done this, but the reason we do something like that is so that when they do sign in, you can send them what they originally asked for, right? A nice little usability thing. Because I don't know about you, but I hate it when I get a link to a specific page on a site. I get there, I'm not signed in yet. So I sign in, and then it doesn't take me to what I originally asked for. I have to paste that URL back in. So adding this in here gives us the ability to do that. So public route basically is exactly the opposite of the other thing. Yeah.
So what does the OR do exactly?
So the whole reason there's even a ternary in here is because with private route, if they are in fact logged in, then we want to render whatever component we asked for, in this case main. Else, we want to kick them to the sign-in page. So this is the logic that does that. If they try to get to something they're not allowed to see, we redirect them to login. Make sense? Does that answer your question? Was that the question? Or did you mean how it works?
Yeah. Like, what's the point of having it, like, the OR specifically there?
Oh, up here?
Yeah.
I have to remember. Oh, right. Yeah, the point is, we learned a couple different ways that you can write routes. Component equals something, or you write a render function, right? So the way it's working here, we didn't specify a component prop. We specified a render function, right? So what this is doing is, okay, if you're logged in and you passed in a render function, we want to run that render function. So this is the render function that was passed in the prop. If there is no render function, then we want to create some JSX to render whatever component you passed in using the component prop. So a route is either going to have the component prop or the render prop, and we want this to work both ways. So that's what that's for. Yeah, the flexibility of either passing in render or component. Public route is basically the opposite. You know, only if you're not logged in should we render what you asked for. If you're logged in, we should redirect you to notes. Now, why would we actually want to stop you from viewing something public? Well, if you look at where we actually used this, we used it for the sign-in page. So if you visit the sign-in page but you're already logged in, we're going to take you to your notes. That's probably what you want, and that's the way a lot of sites work. This way, if you just visit noteherder.com and but if you visit this site without any particular path, what's it going to do? It's going to show you the sign-in page, or is it going to show you your notes? What should the home page be? Well, it should depend on whether you're signed in, right? So maybe we say right off the bat, render the sign-in page. But if you're already logged in, that should redirect you to your notes. Make sense? So this is a fairly advanced topic. Don't feel bad if it's a little overwhelming, but at least you've heard of it now. And you can sort of look up React component composition and see some other tricks. But this is sort of the prototypical example of where you might use this. But maybe you can imagine other scenarios in which you would want to conditionally render components where it might make sense to do it this way instead of putting an if or a ternary right inside the JSX. Because it ends up being very readable back in app.js. Private route, we pass in the same props we expect in any other route. And it tells us private route, public route. We can guess what the point of that is. One requires authentication, one doesn't. Public versus private.